So I was saying that one of the motivations for this work is refinding a kind of passion. So this work and this new research project of mine is something that I intend to spend a long time on because in many ways it's driven by a deep passion. The second motivation for this work, and it's one of the benefits of being now considered an older person in the academy, is that you can learn from your mistakes. And this project in many ways is my attempt to address some of the mistakes or oversights in some of my earlier work. So for instance, in my book, Healthy Democracies, I tell a very positive story in that book. I talk about the universalization of health insurance in Taiwan and South Korea. And I was very happy that colleagues in Korea and Taiwan and around the world said, I think you got the story right. But there were some who said to me, and I didn't take the criticism very seriously at the time, but I do now. They said, you tell a very happy story for 90% of the population, but there are 10% of the population who are being left out. And at that time, I thought, well, 90%, that's still better than, 49%. So I thought, well, 90%, that's good enough, and I was very dismissive of those arguments. But it's true, right? Those 10% that are left out of the system, or as Emmanuel calls them, the silent majority, in fact, it's probably a lot larger than 10% by this calculation, is what motivates this project now. The other motivation, so in my other more recent book on biotechnology, I mean, who would have thought that biotechnology and innovation would have some sort of motivation for this new kind of work, but in that book, I talk a lot about innovation, and I think about innovation in the very conventional way, and indeed the way in which it's thought of here in Korea, as innovation in terms of wealth generation, right? I mean, when you think about the innovation creative economy here in Korea, we're really talking about growing the GDP. We're really talking about finding new industries. We're really talking about generating wealth. And one of the criticisms of that book, or one of the social criticisms of that book, was that I didn't pay very much attention to the distributive consequences of innovation. Right? What actually does an innovation economy do with respect to the distributive consequences? And indeed, what can we take from innovation in terms of the redistributive implications of the redistributive potential of innovation? So it's those two impulses, the populations that had been left behind in my first book, and trying to understand or rethink innovation in my more recent work, and thinking about the distributive and redistributive consequences of that, which informs this new project. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be able to share with you some of my thinking so early on in this project. This is really a new project for me. That is also to say, I welcome your criticisms. There's a saying in English, an idea is just half-baked. And so therefore a half-baked idea is something that can be open to some criticism. This isn't even half-baked. This is at best a quarter-baked. So I would really encourage you to provide some criticism of the work. What I want to do in today's talk is basically walk you through some of my thinking. Some of what I want to tell you is based on some empirical observation. Some of what I'm going to talk about is based on some theoretical reasoning. But what I want to lay out for you is a research agenda. Right? Is really to give you a sense of where my observations and my thinking have brought me to today, and to give you a sense, and maybe even for those of you who are young scholars, to give you a sense to see how you design a research project, how you arrive from a passion or an impulse into a viable research project. And what I want to suggest to you, the overall message is, what I want to convey, is that I want to rethink social welfare, and I want to rethink it in a very specific way by focusing on this concept of reach. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the later sections of this talk. So empirically, this talk, or this project, is motivated by some observations. So this is just a very simple table. It looks at the world's poorest of the poor, the so-called bottom billion. And when you look at this table, and this table is just some data that's compiled by my buddy at King's in the UK, and essentially, this table, we can make three observations. The first observation is that if you look at the world's poorest of the poor in 1988 and you look at the world's poorest of the poor in 2008, one observation we can make is that despite all of this talk about the Millennium Development Goals, despite all of this aggregate global economic growth, we haven't really done a very good job. Right? The world's poorest of the poor continue to be extremely poor, and the aggregate number of the world's poorest of the poor continue to be, in my view, unacceptably high. So that's the first observation. The second observation we can make, and this is getting to the meat of the problem that I want to deal with, is that in 1988, the vast majority of the world's poorest of the poor lived in low-income countries, 93%. In 2008, the vast majority of the world's poorest of the poor now live in middle-income countries. So the implication is quite clear. We have grown economies. We have figured out how to make what were once poor economies into less poor economies. But those who were poor inside those once poor economies continue to be very poor in these now less poor economies. We figured out how to grow the pie, but we haven't figured out how to raise the bottom. Which leads to the third observation. Maybe it's not so much about growth, efficiency, and so on. Maybe indeed what we're dealing with now is a political economy of redistribution. We've figured out how to grow the pie, but what we need to figure out now is how to redistribute the pie, so that these countries that were once poor, now richer, can also raise the floor so that those people, those individuals who were once poor, can lead less miserable lives. We do this, and in many ways this has rekindled the conversation about the state. And it's in many ways rekindled conversation about the welfare state as we think about the political economy of redistribution. But I also want to stress to you, even though we have, I think in many ways, renewed our commitment, maybe it's our ideological commitment, maybe it's our normative commitment, even though we've renewed our commitment to redistribution and renewed our commitment, and hopefully to take the task that Manuel has laid out for us seriously, renewed our commitment to what states can do. The fact of the matter is that it's extremely difficult. The most prevalent challenge is trying to find the very poor, the marginalized, or the precarious. So one of the benefits that I've had in my career is I get to spend a lot of time in the field. And so whereas in my book on biotech I was being driven around by venture capitalists in very nice cars, I now spend most of my time in slums and in the countryside. And one of the things that I've noticed when I've spent time in these slums, a couple things. One is, I never meet the same person twice. So when I'm with informants, and I say, I'll see you in 6 months when I'm back in South Africa. So I have research sites in South Africa, India, and Brazil. I'll be back in 6 months to chat with you again. I'll never find them again. Right? We're talking about an extremely mobile, transient population. The second observation is that they don't have addresses. If you've spent any time in a slum, you will know that there are no addresses. Which of course then leads one to ask the very simple logistical question, how do you deliver a vaccine campaign, for instance, right? A very simple public health intervention that requires a multiple visit. How do you deliver a vaccine campaign to a population that does not have addresses? So this is one of the major challenges that I want to grapple with. So Arjun Appadurai, who's an anthropologist, has done some work in the slums of Mumbai, and he writes, a host of local, state level, and federal entities exist with a mandate to rehabilitate or ameliorate slum life. But none of them know exactly who the slum dwellers are, where they live, and how they are to be identified. In other words, these people are invisible. They are beyond the reach of the state. So no matter what normative or moral investment we may put into the political economy of redistribution and the welfare state, the fact of the matter is, when you're dealing in slums where people don't have addresses, these people are invisible to the state. This raises, however, the imperative, and I hope I've convinced you, the absolute imperative to reach those who have been, till now, unreachable and invisible. The problem, and this is where the political economy lies, reach, and therefore redistribution, is expensive. Take, for instance, a recent article in the New York Times about elections in India. In India, to register for the vote, right, as long as there's a certain population density, the state will put a voting registration booth there, right? And so therefore then in more densely populated areas, people go and they'll register. The challenge, however, is how do you register those voters who live way out in the countryside, or who live way out in the mountains, or who live way out in the deserts? The imperative is to reach them. If you want to fulfill your democratic right, if you as a democracy want to fulfill the rights of your own citizens, you need to reach them. But how do you actually reach them? And in this article in the New York Times, bringing democracy to these places is not cheap. Simrandeep Singh, the official in Leh District, said that his office had already spent more than $1,655 per voter, with most of the money going to fuel and voting awareness campaigns in distant corners of the district. In other words, the point here is to reach the unreached, to reach those furthest from the state, spatially, politically, metaphorically, is extremely expensive. The cost of enrolling an additional voter, $1,600, and this is a country in which per capita GDP, depending on how you measure, is between $4,000 and $6,000. This is a significant amount of money, resources, being used to reach those people who are unreached. Now, this in many ways challenges the conventional wisdom, because we typically think of good welfare states as being the universalization of services. And through the universalization and expansion of services, essentially we can realize the economies of scale. The presumption being that then you can reduce cost per intervention. The fact of the matter, however, is if you're trying to enroll that additional voter, the cost is actually much higher. The cost of reaching that additional voter may in fact cost more than certainly the material benefit. So that's the key tension that we're dealing with here, right? The imperative to reach, but the extraordinary cost to reach those who have been previously unreached. And this in many ways is what I mean by the new political economy of redistribution, and indeed that of social welfare. Now, in the advanced industrial countries, notwithstanding Emmanuel's excellent intervention, we tend to underestimate or underappreciate the problem of reach. So, for instance, in Ontario, we all have a health card, right? And we take this health card for, I mean, we take it for granted, right? But just think about how important this one little piece of technology is with respect to the realization of your rights. For instance, this health card means that you exist. So there's an existential quality to having a number, having been formally identified. It also means that you enjoy a kind of administrative visibility. You exist in the eyes of the state. It also entitles you to a legitimate claim to benefits. And indeed, in the case of a universal healthcare system, such as in Canada, it entitles you to a standardized claim to, in this case, health benefits. In other words, this very much take for granted piece of plastic, in many ways, is a technology of the state which allows the state to see you. It provides what Jim Scott says, I think, in a much more critical way, but it allows the state, it gives the state the technology to make you visible, to make you legible, to ensure that you exist, and thereby ensuring that you exist, also ensuring that you have the legitimate claim to your rights as a citizen. So the point I want to make here is actually the welfare state canon, and Emmanuel has already raised this issue, I think, very brilliantly. The welfare state canon and the model by which we understand welfare states presumes visibility. If you think about it in its stripped down form, what the welfare state really is about the state's capacity to extract surplus resources in the form of either taxes or insurance premiums and so on, and redistribute or allocate those resources in more or less progressive ways. That's essentially what a welfare state is. But this conception of the welfare state emerges in a particular moment in time. It emerges in a particular mode of industrial capitalism. It coincides with the rise of a factory system. It coincides with the rise of a working class. It coincides with an organization of the working class into trade unions, which gives it a kind of political visibility, and so on. So in essence then, the canon of the welfare state, one of the best predictors that we've relied on in terms of welfare state generosity, is to look at labor union density and size, right? I mean, that's essentially what the canon has argued. That's essentially what power resources theory and so on argues. What I want to suggest, however, is that the welfare state can only extract what it can see, and it can only redistribute to those who it can see. And for time immemorial, in terms of the historical development of the welfare state, what the welfare state could see were formal sector workers. The welfare state, in terms of the Bismarckian social insurance state, to the social insurance state here in Korea, was never intended to protect the very poor. If one looks at the social history, and E.P. Thompson's work is phenomenal, if one looks at the social history of poverty, for instance, and the poor, one only has to look at the poor laws in the UK or in England to understand that the welfare state was never intended to protect the very poor. The very poor and those who were impoverished were understood to be social outcasts, right? Poverty was a social problem. So the point here is that the welfare state was never intended to protect the very poor. It was by and large intended to protect the interests of formal sector workers. And frankly, it worked for a long time because we didn't care about the rest. We didn't care about the invisible majority. So the big theme of the work that I'm trying to propagate now is this idea of invisibility. Those who most need protection and redistribution are those who are most invisible. In other words, they live in, as one of our colleagues pointed out yesterday, they live in the state's blind spot. So what I want to talk to you about today, really then, I want to convey to you stories about the developing world, but I want you to think about these stories about the developing world as they relate to the Korean example. Because the parallels, I think, are extremely striking, and the insights that we can gain, I think, are important. So part of the problem, as I see it today, and indeed Emmanuel, I think, has already done a fantastic job in highlighting this, part of the problem is the changing structure of labor markets. So we've seen, for instance, in advanced industrial countries, the dualization of labor markets. We've seen, for instance, in the case of Korea, the very large size of the self-employed sector. We know, for instance, from the work of people like Martin C. Kaiser and so on, that 75% of new jobs in OECD countries are part-time, contractual, informal, non-standard work, and so on. We are seeing the increased dualization of labor in advanced industrial countries. This has, I want to suggest to you, always been a challenge in the developing world. So if one looks, for instance, the percentage of the working population employed in the informal sector, including agriculture, in sub-Saharan Africa, 75%, South and Southeast Asia, 70%, Latin America, 50%. And what we're seeing actually is more and more people are moving from the countryside into the city. We're not actually seeing a decrease in the size of the informal sector because the jobs they're picking up are in the informal sector. So these numbers are not declining. For instance, in the case of India, it's estimated that 92% of those who work, including in the agricultural sector, would be considered informal. So what we have here is a kind of fiscal invisibility, right? And it's a kind of fiscal invisibility that is beyond the reach of the state, in which then I would conclude, and I have in some of my writing, in many ways then the fiscal dimension of the welfare state renders the welfare state of today an institutional anachronism. It just simply doesn't meet. It simply doesn't complement or align with the structure of labor market. But it's not just about labor markets. 35% of children born in the world are not registered. In the case of India, for instance, only 40% of babies who are born, children who are born, are registered before the age of 5. In Bangladesh, we're talking about 35%. Right? A generation ago in South Africa, it was about 25%. Worldwide, as I've already suggested you, 35% of the world's babies, newborns, are not registered. As UNICEF has reported, the births of nearly 230 million under the age of 5 have never been registered. So this lack, as they say, of formal recognition by the state usually means that a child is unable to obtain a birth certificate, and as a result, he or she may be denied healthcare or education. Later in life, you can already imagine the knock-on effects. All right, so we're talking about 250 million newborns are not in any way made visible by the state. They are, in many respects, invisible to the state. This is one of the slums that I work in. I show this picture just so you get a sense of what these places look like. It's a place where I dare not go in by myself because I would get lost. It's a place where I never see the same respondent twice. Right? What I want to stress to you is that the poor, the marginalized, the precarious experience myriad forms of invisibility. And taken together, they probably do amount to an invisible majority. The very poor, the precarious, the marginalized are fiscally invisible, as I've already described. If one considers that 2/3 of children in a poor country are not registered, they experience a lifelong kind of invisibility from the state. In slums in which you have no address, you experience a kind of physical invisibility. In the case, for instance, of China, if you're a migrant worker and you move beyond your particular district and your hukou now no longer covers you, you are, for all intents and purposes, administratively invisible. And migrant workers in China amount to, hundreds of millions of people. You're effectively off the map. And of course, as we know, the poorest of the poor tend to be politically invisible. I want to suggest to you, actually, just metaphorically speaking, it's not just physical, fiscal, political, the kinds of invisibility I've talked about that particularly affect the poor and marginalized, but there are also cultural invisibilities. In Canada, for instance, one of the major issues is mental health. And until very recently, those who suffered from mental health issues, mental health illnesses, were invisible. There's a kind of cultural invisibility. And I show this Bell Let's Talk because this is a real social campaign. It's done through social media, where on January 29th of every year, you can tweet with the hashtag Bell Let's Talk. And the company, Bell, which is an info telecom, donates 5 cents per tweet. And I remember being at a basketball game, actually, with my son, and they showed how many tweets had been made that day. 122 million tweets. It's a phenomenal effort. And I just thought to myself, this is a phenomenal effort in making visible a whole segment of the population who had been effectively rendered invisible. And I'm sure you can understand the example, and I give this example specifically because this is a huge issue in Korea as well. So the point here is that there are myriad sources of invisibility, and provided that these people remain invisible, then they are beyond the reach of the state. So the punchline, therefore, then, is if we really care about inequality, if we really want to reduce poverty, the welfare state, or the state, then, is about extraction, it's about redistribution, but it's also about reach. So in the area of healthcare, which is an area which I've written considerably, one of the major debates is about universal healthcare. And the major argument in terms of universal healthcare is to lower fees, increase access. Lower user fees, point of access fees, for instance. And as long as we do that, then we can reach a more better universal healthcare, or UHC. I want to suggest to you that these are all provider side. Right? These are provider side changes. These are provider side considerations, and they are important, but they're not enough. They don't address the problem of reach. Behavioral economists will talk about reach in terms of the last mile problem. How do you traverse that last mile to actually get that person to utilize that resource, right? Just simply expanding access and simply expanding the provision of intervention X doesn't necessarily mean they're going to use it. So behavioral economists look at how do you traverse that last mile. For me, it's more than that. It's about overcoming the problem of invisibility. It's about making visible the invisible. The point here is that by making visible the invisible, we're really talking about inclusion. We want to make those who have been invisible visible in order for them to be included. Now, if you think about most social policy debates, when we talk about inclusion, we talk about expansion. When we talk about including those who have been excluded, the main resolution, the main solution is to expand, to increase access, to increase eligibility, to increase provision. It's about expanding the margins further. But what I want to argue is that actually inclusion is not simply about expansion willy-nilly, but actually inclusion is about targeting. And targeting actually requires precision. So as one official from Brazil remarked once to the World Bank, if all the resources spent on social policies in Brazil were dropped from a helicopter, they would have a better chance of reaching the poor than they have now. Right? So the implication here is to reach those who have been unreached, to make visible those who have been, till now, invisible, requires not just simply the expansion of pre-existing services or interventions, but also ensuring greater targeting. In this respect, then, reach is about targeting, it's about precision, and it's about cost. So one of the cases that we're working on now, actually I have a group of students, phenomenally gifted and energetic students, who are working on the case of Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia, if you don't know, Bolsa Familia is a conditional cash transfer program that's been implemented in Brazil. And it's very simple. I mean, the Latin Americans have been at the forefront of these kinds of conditional cash transfers for forever. But essentially what it is that it's a cash transfer directly to those who have been determined to be poor, and you receive this cash transfer provided that you meet the conditions. And the conditions would be, for instance, ensuring that your child is enrolled in school, ensuring that they attend school, ensuring that your children are vaccinated, ensuring that they see a primary healthcare physician once a year. And so you have essentially a system in which the state is directly transferring resources to the bottom, or those who have been identified to be in the bottom income quintile. There is a monitoring mechanism whereby then it's a co-responsibility system. You get the cash, but you are responsible for meeting the conditionality. What's interesting about Bolsa Familia is that it's not universal. It's not a basic income grant, for instance, as they're discussing in South Africa and as they've implemented elsewhere. It is aimed at the lowest income quintile, the bottom 20%. In other words, it is about targeting. Now, how do you target? How do you ensure that you reach the bottom 20%? Well, the old way is that the poor would need to go to the state. Right? The poor would have to seek the state. The state would provide resources, would create eligibility, would open access, but the responsibility was for the poor, the invisible, to reach the state. I had an opportunity to have a conversation with the Minister of Social Development from Brazil when she was in London, and she showed me this slide. What they're focusing on now is the state shall go where poverty is. Now, this difference between the left poster and the right poster is in many ways quite nuanced, but actually it's extremely important. The poster on the right is all about reach. It's about targeting. It's about reaching those who have been otherwise marginalized. And what she suggests is that this, in fact, is not easy to do. It's not just about expansion, but really it's actually about crossing the literal and the proverbial river. It's actually about, as we saw in the case of India, getting in the jeeps, hiking those last 50 miles to reach the people you need to reach. We're focused on Bolsa Familia because Bolsa Familia has been, and I have no stakes in the argument about conditional cash transfers. So, you know, you can lambaste me all you want about whether it's good or bad. I don't really care. What I'm more concerned about is the phenomenal ability of the state to have reached a significant portion of the poorest of the poor. So of all of the Latin American conditional cash transfer programs, Brazil's been the most successful in ensuring that the resources devoted to Bolsa Familia, or the majority of them, have in fact reached those in the poorest quintile. And the 25% of those benefits that would be considered leakage have been found to be in benefits that are being distributed to the next income quintile. So it's not being leaked to the rich, but rather it's being leaked to the slightly less but still very poor. And what my students are essentially looking at is how has the Brazilian government done this? And there are a whole host of costly but nonetheless effective technologies. The creation of a new census, the employment of new technologies, for instance, ID cards, bank cards, and so on. The expectation of local adaptation. So local municipal governments are, in many ways, designing public health and public education campaigns to reach the poorest of the poor in their neighborhoods. And also recognizing the political payoff that comes with this. And so the Workers' Party in Brazil has actually received quite a bit of a political payoff as a result. It's not perfect. And as the bank has indicated, the two types of households that appear costly to register for Bolsa Familia and seem to have been disproportionately excluded from the cadastro, which is the main registry in census, are those living in remote rural areas, the hardest to reach, and those living in high-risk urban environments, for instance, favelas. So even here, despite the efforts of the Brazilian government to reach the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized of the marginalized, the hardest to reach remain hard to reach because they're extremely costly to reach, and it's unclear what the political payoff will be. So we have some empirical observations, we have some case study work, we have some theoretical reasoning, and all of this adds up to what I would like to propose to be a new research agenda, and a research agenda that focuses on the problem of reach. I've already explained to you why I see this as a political economy of redistribution. I've already explained to you why I see the problem of redistribution being compounded by the realities of invisibility. I've already tried to make the argument to you that inclusion is not simply about expansion, but rather inclusion is about precise targeting. And in the end, it's about costs, and indeed it's about benefits. So in terms of this new research agenda, I just want to offer you a few reflections and some of the challenges. The first challenge is, how do we measure reach? This is a real challenge, right? So, and we're grappling with this right now, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a conceptual distinction between access and reach. I can describe to you conceptually the difference between access and reach, but it's not clear to me how I would be able to measure the difference between access and reach. Another problem in terms of measurement is, how do we measure reach when we have very inaccurate denominators? Right? If we're trying to think about reach as reaching the last 5 to 10% or 20% or whatever it may be, but because these people have been heretofore invisible, we actually have a very shaky denominator. So that would then lead to, I think, results that we might be less confident about. We're also really trying to figure out how to measure reach in terms of a composite metric. And so one of the things that we're looking at, because this is really the only data that's available to us, is the gap between provision and uptake, which is usually basically household utilization data. That's not enough. We're also looking at variation in uptake within populations within a nation, so looking at regional variations and trying to understand there if that gives us a better sense of reach. And also through survey data looking at utilization of alternative interventions to that those are being provided by the state. The other challenge, of course, are the data limitations. So, you know, conceptually, I think we're getting to the idea of reach. With the use of examples, I think I can successfully convince you that it's important, but we have a real problem with measurement. And one of the reasons why we're looking at Bolsa Familia is because the bank has actually insisted that BF collect probably the best data around, because that was one of the World Bank conditions upon the loan. So that's one of the reasons why we're looking at Bolsa Familia. The second part of this research agenda is really looking at the design of reach, right? So behavioral economists, the Banerjee and Duflos, the Dean Carlins, you know, Pascal Dupas and people like that, talk about and have provided for us, I think, much really interesting individual level analysis of decision-making processes, largely through RCTs, or randomized controlled trials. And they've uncovered for us a lot of different ways in which we can understand risk, we can understand discounting strategies as is affected by income, the role of influencers, social monitoring, and so on. But it's not just about the behavioralists, it's also a challenge for institutional designers. And so Jeff Wood, in writing back in 2004, the relationship between the state and people in poor countries has always relied heavily upon intermediate institutions. So he already picked up on this a long time ago. That is, the means and instruments have to be different from the fiscal ones of the welfare state regimes in the canon. There have to be other institutions that are mediating the relationship between the state and those who have been heretofore invisible. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this research, therefore, then, is to look at empirical best practices. How have people been doing this? Right? What examples can we actually find? I mean, we look at things like mobile banking, we're looking at conditional cash transfers, We're looking at microfinance schemes, common property partnerships, local credit or insurance pools, and so on. Trying to find alternative institutions that are allowing the state, as a form of institutional best practice, that allow the state to make visible the invisible. Indeed, the social media campaign that I just showed you about Twitter in Bell Let's Talk, I think is a fantastic example of these new kinds of technologies and institutions that would allow for greater reach. But I'm also a political scientist, and politics matters. And really, I mean, this whole last slide was Emmanuel's talk. I mean, Emmanuel just laid out all of the political challenges for us, right? The old politics of the welfare state are no longer relevant. So the real critique of Emmanuel's talk, and the real critique I would make, is of the left, of the failure to recognize the institutional incongruity of the old welfare state institutions and the new realities of labor markets and the very poor. And so the old politics of the welfare state are no longer relevant, and they also entail entrenched interests. For example, Emmanuel's aunt. Or as David Rueda in his work on social democracy inside out talks about labor market or welfare state insiders and outsiders. And so the description that essentially Rueda makes, and it's affirmed by what Emmanuel was saying, is that social democratic parties now are basically faced with a challenge. Who do you represent? Do you represent the outsiders or do you represent the insiders? And the empirical evidence seems to suggest that social democratic parties, for all the reasons Emmanuel has already said, they tend to represent the outsiders. The insiders. Right? And so you have a kind of political stagnation there. So what we really need to get at, therefore, then, is a new politics. Right? And Rueda and his colleagues, David, I think, start pointing us in the right direction, where they say, even where they're large in number, labor market outsiders, the invisible majority, face stark disadvantages in the democratic process. While labor market insiders benefit from concentrated interests, i.e. they seek above all else protection, security, job security, and impressive powers of collective action, that is to say unions, outsiders have heterogeneous preferences, as one of you raised, and face severe limitations on collective mobilization. The point here is that these interests are heterogeneous. The politics of insiders and outsiders is zero-sum. And the politics among those who are outsiders suffer from collective action problems. Now, this does not mean it's impossible. What it means is that we have to change our lens. We have to begin to think about new forms of political mobilization. It probably doesn't do us very much good anymore to count unions, and to count union density, and to count union side as the best predictor of labor market or welfare state generosity. But as yet, because the field, for all the reasons Emmanuel said, has not moved beyond, we don't see these things. And so one of the challenges that we've laid out for ourselves in this research is to actually go out and look at the empirics. Look and see how those who have been invisible are trying to make themselves more politically visible, and those who are successful, what are the challenges that are prevalent, and what makes that political visibility so different. So let me say in closing then, essentially what I presented to you is a new research agenda, and revealed to you in all of my own intellectual vulnerabilities and anxieties, because I'm not sure if this is right or not, but I've tried to present to you the thought process that takes me from walking around in a slum and asking how do you deliver a vaccine campaign, walking us then through some of the theories of the welfare state, and then takes us to now this new research agenda. Let me finish by saying I want to stress that this new research agenda is very much informed by theory, but it's very much motivated by empirical observation. And our theories just don't match, as Emmanuel has nicely pointed out. Our theories just don't match existing empirical realities. So that's where I am on this research project. This is a project that I've committed myself to for probably the next 10 years or so. So I'll be working on this for a long time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very exciting and inspiring, and also I think it also has a lot of implications for Korean case, the delivery system in Korea at the moment, and I think we also have a lot to talk about governance related to this. Why don't we open the floor, open to the floor and take questions. Yes?
Sorry, I don't know. First, it is very interesting talk, and I think the talk which is very important and also contributor. So, with this issue, from my perspective, I don't know much about this conceptual difference between access and the reach, but just my response, the prompt response is reach seems to be a service provider's perspective, whereas the access means for consumers have access to these services. So I don't know whether it is a distinction. And from my response to your differences is which seems to be more emphasized government perspective or service provider's perspective. And I think I have two questions. The first one is about your emphasis about the targeting precision of this reach. So I think these two terms that you put together is the way we just identify the boundary and also how we can develop the policies for these people. So my question is how we can, when I look at this targeting precision, it seems to me the recipient really need more the strong capacity to enhance this precision and delivery, or as you point as technological innovation development, or say it can be interdependent, or in many countries that research, many social services are provided by non-state organizations. So do you also refer to this kind of, if I call this intermediate organization, because also these are the key vectors to enhance this kind of targeting precision. So which factor might be more important or more effective way to enhance this targeting and the precision issue? My first question. My second question is more practical side. So you mentioned about the familiar program in that countries, and you also mentioned about the variation of the countries and the ways which they can be more successful or better than others. And you mentioned the Brazilian case more the successful case. I don't know much about these topics, but my first response is that Brazil was involved by more people rather than Mexico, Argentina, or Chile for the past decade or so. That's wondering, is this may be successful with this program, especially currently really for is it more dependent on the local partnership government, or are there any different tools implemented by Brazilian government? Was the government effective or in this program, or is it can be more explained by traditional policy like the available case of college issue?
So let me answer the second one first. I don't. We may be in the weeds and therefore missing the bigger picture, but one of the things that we've been trying to look at is forget, for instance, that this is the PT party. Forget for a moment that this is Lula's big plan. We do see a major political payoff for the PT party in the recent elections and in the 2006 elections as a result, presumably, of Bolsa Familia. But the actual means and the methods and the technologies, hard and soft, by which the state reaches the 75%, right, of the poorest income quintile are not ideological. I mean, there's no ideological spin on it at all. In fact, we see tremendous variation. So when you look at subnational variation, it's actually municipal governments that are implementing this. There's no correlation at all. There's no relationship with the ideology of the implementing municipal governments. It's really about, I mean, you can call it capacity or state capacity. You know, that's a term that we're familiar with in political science. I mean, for us, it's just, how are they actually doing it, right, before we call it anything? Which lends itself to the first, and one of the things actually we're seeing therefore then is each of these municipalities are coming up with different strategies to one, properly identify, minimize inclusion and exclusion error, and so on. You know, in some areas they're using television campaigns, in some areas they're using students and young children, in some areas that are more urban they're using television. I mean, so each of these regions are using different means. I mean, it's not a particularly exciting story as well. I mean, we're really just looking at what do they do. But until we actually ask what do they do, I think we reside too high in the level of that sort of concept. So that's itself then to the first question. That's absolutely right. The intermediate institutions are completely agnostic as to what they might include. And this is an empirical project in many ways. so we want to just go around and look and see. So can we imagine private sector actors being involved? Absolutely. I mean, one of the funders for the most familiar case study I was telling you now actually is MasterCard. Right? I mean, MasterCard has a CSR division, Center for Social and Inclusive Growth. But they're also the ones that are providing the verification technology for the cards. Right? So, because the state couldn't do it. The state doesn't have the capacity to do it, doesn't have the distribution channels, and it certainly doesn't have the verification technology. Which, if you think about it, that's one of the most important elements of any cash transfer program, is you need to minimize leakage. To minimize leakage, you need rapid verification. Fact matters, MasterCard has it. Right? So, I'm totally agnostic to what kinds of intermediate institutions emerge. Rather, it's just recognizing that A, the limits of the state, that doesn't mean the forever limits of the state, it's rather the state recognizing that it has to adjust to new realities. Or non-governmental organizations. We see increasingly NGOs on the delivery side of social services and so on. So those intermediate institutions, even as Jeff would put it, are not limited to state institutions or public institutions. Your question about access and reach, I think it's a very, I don't know how to answer it. I mean, the way in which you posed it is a really interesting way, right? So is the onus on the provider side or the demand side? Is access, is that more of a demand side question or more of a supply or provider side question? I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to think about it. But that is actually a really good way of asking the question as we try to figure out how to conceptually refine it. But, I mean, that's the thing. Like, I think that we all instinctively understand what I mean by reach. But, as I always encourage my PhD students, okay, now remove pronouns and give us the abstract conceptualization. I'm not there yet. I still have to give examples. I have to use proper words.
I have two questions. One is on the accountability of reach, because in reaching, I think it's really important to know who to reach to, the state. So in that part, I think the violation of privacy could come out. So I think that's the part where you could focus and trying to explain to someone like me. And then the second question was on the process, because you said because Geoff Wood said the means and instruments have to be different from the fiscal ones of welfare state regimes. So here I thought for the invisibles to become visible, the important part is the fiscal part. The main reason states consider invisibles to become visible, and the part where you think it's important for them to become visible isn't it the physical parts? So
physical or fiscal?
Fiscal. So as you mentioned about MasterCard, it's all about money. So I thought if it's not something, if it has to be, if the means and instruments have to be different from the fiscal ones, what else could there be?
That's a great question. The fiscal mechanism of the state, the challenge with the fiscal mechanisms of the state is that it emerges from and it relies on an earlier notion of formal work, right? And so what Jeff Wood is trying to argue and what I'm trying to argue empirically is that's an important form of visibility, but it may not be the only one, right? Because if it is the only one, and to date it largely is the only one, then it will render a significant portion of the population invisible, or it could lead to inequitable results. So you look, for instance, at the self-employed sector here in Korea. One of the major challenges in terms of assessing social insurance premiums is what exactly is the income of 50% of the population. And it can lead to quite deleterious results when you have the super rich who are self-employed and hiding income, and you have the extraordinarily poor who are also, you know, trying to game the system, and the net result, usually, in the absence of any other indicators of wealth, is that the rich disproportionately benefit. And that's one of the big problems of social insurance systems that have large self-employed sectors. So all I'm saying is that the fiscal one is important. I wouldn't consider MasterCard or the technology to be a fiscal mechanism. It's a mechanism by which you're verifying identification. You know, so I mean, consider, you know, 600 million people in India don't have ID. I mean, this is really kind of a serious problem. I mean, one of the reasons why Bolsa Familia works in Brazil is that voting is mandatory, which means that a female head of household has a voter's card, which is a form of ID. And that's if you really want to know the answer, that's why it works, right? So, you know, but that's just another, that's a kind of administrative visibility. You know, as I was showing, for instance, the Ontario health insurance card, that really is not kind of administrative visibility. I mean, there are a whole host. You know, I was doing some work. I had an opportunity to do some work on Bedouin Arab villages in Israel, and you look at there's a category of unrecognized Bedouin villages. And so we did work there. One of my students was doing some work, she's an engineering student on electrification. And so we were in the desert, and I was standing, you know, in this village, and like this highway runs right through this village. And I said to the village leader, I said, well, this is crazy. Like, why do you have a highway where, you know, you must have been really mad. And he said, yeah, I was really mad. I said, well, why didn't you go to the state? Right? And he said, well, I did. And I went to the government, and the state pulled out a map and said, you don't exist. Right? So we'll build this highway. So, I mean, that's just an example of where that kind of invisibility, right? It has nothing to do with physical mechanisms. It has just simply to do with a kind of physical. In the WHO, one of the biggest challenges right now with managing the Ebola crisis is it cannot use the regular tools of epidemiology because people don't have addresses. So it's a real problem, right? So it's multiple kinds of invisibility that I think. Yes.
My name is Rita from the Department of Social Welfare. You talked about how the state should reach. You talked about how the state should provide new mechanisms in reaching the invisible. And what I want to find out from your research, did you come across situations where the invisible don't want to be reached?
Great question. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And this is one of the major conundrums. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, this is something that you're absolutely right. I mean, so, you know, when we interview, for instance, micro firms, right, informal micro firms, they don't want to be reached. They don't want to be made visible because then they would lose draw on their resources by being integrated into the fiscal system. Jim Scott, you know, whose work I admire, and he's a dear friend, you know, I told him, I apologized to him, I said, I'm totally stealing from your concept of legibility, but I'm trying to put a positive spin on it. And he said, you know, you have my blessing, but I think that you're wrong. There are populations that don't want to be reached, that don't want to be seen. So you're absolutely right. Have we come across this in our research? Not so much yet, but we are, I do have a group of students who want to set up some research in Burma, and I would expect that Muslims living on the borderlands don't want to be seen. So it'd be an interesting experiment there. But you're right, absolutely right. It's a real problem.
Well, connected to that, I was thinking the same. Like, okay, so we are conducting a project in Spain and Italy, and we basically interview outsiders. And what we have noticed is that we don't manage. Like, we had to make a very conscious effort for interviewing real outsiders, in the sense that people are out of reach, to use the terminology. They will not be willing to be reached, and they don't talk to the state. They have no relationship with the state. I'm talking about Italy and Spain. You know, like the challenges you're proposing are even more incredible, and that's the thing why your work is so important. And I was, you know, like thinking all the way through, like all the way you were saying, is that we need to learn from these extreme cases. I think if you want to tell a story about reach, yeah, you can measure whatever, but your story will be told from these most extreme examples, in a sense. From the one who either are unreachable for the reason we were all highlighting, or from the one who don't want to be reached. These for you are the critical control cases for whatever theory you want to go through. Because if you manage to get to understand and explain, or even lay out the problems, you might come up with a thing, say, that like 20% of the population with this instrument you will not reach, and this will be a considerable interesting result. And these two type of population tells you a lot about it, and that's the first point. And I think that's the first things I was thinking. When you start to talk about that, exactly my mind went exactly in that direction, because we face the same problem, although to a lower degree in sorts of, well, so if we want to call Mediterranean countries developed countries. Other points, and I think, I could go on forever because it was very, very thought-provoking, and that's about metrics. I was thinking through what you were saying about your difficulty in mapping one thing, and one thing I was thinking that you could think about is to try, you talk about multidimensionality at some point, to really conceive your measure through surveys or whatever evidence you can gather by using descriptive factorial techniques. I think it really calls for that. Like I will tell you, like in Bordeusian term, like multiple correspondence analysis, because there you can also link quantitative and qualitative evidence. So if you manage to start to think about multiple axes, because there you would have problems, like you would have in certain countries, you would have certain dimensions which are stronger than others, and what you want to do is to try to plot. Now you might not be able to plot that with full quantitative methods, but thinking about a map with multiple axes in the multiple correspondence analysis fashion would help you in two ways. One, because you can plot that, but the other one is that you can bring qualitative evidence within quants. I mean, if you want, we can discuss about it, but I'm very passionate about it. There's a very good work by Mike Savage on urban, on cities, so it's a very geographical concept.
He uses this.
Yeah, which he matches quantitative multiple correspondence analysis with the use of qualitative fieldwork, in-depth questions to sort of build up multiple dimensions and types, because you might have types of, if you look from the point of view of people, you have types, and then you can go back to the idea of how institutions reach these different types and how they're reachable or not. And other things like...
Can you give us the household level, can that give us distributed outcomes?
Yeah. We can talk about it more. It's like, there are technical implications, but I think it's whatever method you use, it's good to think in a like geographical space, and also think in factorial terms in terms of multiple dimensions, because your story is first of all a descriptive story, and I think that today we need again good descriptions of reality, because we told that it's all about causal mechanism that matters, but in reality, when you talk about these problems, the first problem is about description. If we don't describe the phenomenon, then we don't have an empirical. We can only have a discussion on what we think, but we cannot have an empirical discussion. And other things like, I was in Brazil 2 years and a half ago, and one of the ideas through, the idea of the invisible majority and it came through was exactly being in a slum while they were administering targeting for the Bolsa Família. Okay, so I was with these people with a doctor. It was a friend of mine who brought me into a slum. And I was there in the village when the people of the Bolsa Família were there assessing families. Now, what you're saying, it's amazing, and most people who don't do any qualitative research will never get your point about the fact that you cannot meet the same person twice. These people have incredible instruments. I mean, I was really shocked. I was really impressed by the fact that how they knew the slum and the people in the slum. And each municipality does it in a different way. And so, it's incredible. Like in Western countries, we don't have means to identify the outsiders as they do. And so
the implication of what you're saying, though, is that it's also very costly.
Yeah, it's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly expensive.
It's not only material costs, but informal knowledge.
Yeah.
I mean, these are all costs. Anyway, so
you need to pay people to be there. Like it's incredibly costly, and that's one of the problems they have with the Bolsa Família. It's how much it costs to administer. How high are the administrative costs compared to the whatever $50 money they give?
they give to these people. But what is interesting and the implication of your work, and I think you need to make the most out of it in the future, like as a good thing that speaks to the literature, is that thinking to richness to how to reach people in developing context teach us a lot on the general stories on the welfare state in developed economies. And I had a friend of mine who is an Africanist who was telling me, if you want to understand the south of Italy, you need to study Africa. Post-colonial studies. And I think, you know, what you do and the fact that you come from a study of general welfare tradition and then going to these problems and back again to these ideas can make a wonderful contribution. You know, if you will write a book on this whole story, you know, about how to use that. And the last point, really, I promise I...
Just apropos,
yeah.
I mean, I work with a group of engineers, doctors, behavioralists, and we go out in the field every year. We go on one trip together. Last year we did one on clean cook stoves. The year before we did one on eye hospitals. We did one on Aboriginals and Eastern. This year we're going to northern British Columbia, and we fully expect that all of the insights that we've gained from southern India,